Hey everybody, John Fenn here, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org. Hey, visit the App Store. We now have an app at the App Store. Look for CWOWI. It may say education under it. It's the Church Without Walls International, CWOWI, at the App Store. It's our app is. I really think it's amazing. It's crisp. It's clear. It's easy to use. Got several different categories: podcasts, teachings, things of that nature. So I think it'd be a blessing to you. So CWOWI at the App Store. All right. Today I want to get into this question. Do you hate yourself? Do you question your salvation? Do you have a hard time forgiving yourself? I'm my own worst enemy. I can forgive everybody in the world, but I have a hard time forgiving myself. I went through a time when my dad and mom announced that they were getting divorced. You know, I'm the oldest of four kids, and I think all of us four kids at one point or another in that process, back when we were children, felt like if we weren't alive, mom and dad would still be together. You know, if we weren't here, we had talks about running away. We talked about these things as us four kids. We were 11, 9, 7, and 5 years old. I was the oldest at 11. We were 11, 9, 7, and 5 when they announced they were getting divorced. And so you have this sense of, you know, if I wasn't here, things would be better. And I don't know what your story is. Maybe you had a childhood like that, came from a broken home, whatever the case is. Many times we doubt our salvation because we can't forgive ourselves. You know, you don't know what I've done, or you don't know how I walked with the Lord when I was young, and then I stepped away and I was in sin. And even after I got born again, you know, I was in sin. I mean, you may have stories like that, you know, that you have a hard time forgiving yourself. You have a hard time believing in the grace of God. Well, you're not alone. The Apostle Paul went through a similar wrestling, and he talks about that in several places. And so I want to introduce you to his wrestling and what he went through. You know, we have the idea that the Apostle Paul was born again and he became an apostle. He wrote the New Testament. Boy, he said, you know, to the Philippians, I haven't yet arrived. I have not yet attained, but I'm pressing toward the mark of the high call of God in Christ Jesus. And we dismiss that. We think, yeah, but you're the Apostle Paul. No, Paul was a human being. He went from persecuting Christians to meeting Jesus on the road to Damascus, and then learning, going through a process. He talked about 3 years in Arabia, in the wilderness, learning from the Lord by revelation, the Lord appearing to him and teaching him. He tells that when he writes to the Galatians. So he wrestled with things. Nowhere is this found more clearly than in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 8 through 10. In 1 Corinthians 15, the first few verses, he's talking about how the Lord appeared. After his resurrection, he was seen by more than 500 people at one time. And when Paul is writing this, he says the greater part of them are still alive to this day. They can tell you the story, how they saw the resurrected Jesus. And Paul said, I wasn't there. He missed the ministry of Jesus. And he concludes in verse 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8. He says, I was one born out of due time. Now, that phrase, due time, is a Greek word, ektroma. E-K-T-R-O-M-A, ektroma. It was used initially in the Roman Senate when a bill would be introduced, when some senator would want to make a law, and that bill would be introduced into the committee or even on the floor of the Senate, and it would be voted down or it would be killed in committee. And this is the phrase used today in many different congresses and parliaments around the world, that if a bill is introduced but then it dies in committee or it's killed in committee, they say, oh, we're not going to go further with this. That was in the Roman Senate. That was the word ektroma. It meant a miscarriage or an abortion, because a bill would be introduced, then it would be killed, and so it would die in committee or in the Senate. And so that word ektroma became initially a miscarriage of a bill or an abortion of a bill, and it came to be in common knowledge when a woman would have a miscarriage, or they even had primitive abortions back then. Even the cesarean section came from Caesar, came from that era. And so Paul was saying this of himself. He was saying, I feel like I was born out of due time. I feel like my life should have been a miscarriage or an abortion. That's an amazing statement. And he says it's because he persecuted the church. In fact, in 1 Timothy chapter, 1:15 or 2:15, he says, This is in 1 Timothy 2:15, I believe it is. He says, this is a true saying and worthy to receive, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Even then, the Apostle Paul, to his protege, to his son in the faith, to the one he's mentoring, he says, he's revealing himself in this letter, and he said, I feel like I'm a chief sinner. And think of the grace of God he had, and yet he's still carrying these feelings. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 15, he says this. He's talking about his life and everything else, and he opens up and he says this. He says, it pleased God to have me born alive from my mother's womb. Now, see, in that day and age, childbirth today is risky enough, but in that day and age, you could have a 50% mortality rate among babies, who die within the first year, or they die in childbirth. And so it was very risky. But in Galatians 1:15, he said, it pleased God that I was born alive out of my mother's womb. He had to wrestle with that like we do. Why did God make me born? Just to sin? Just to miss salvation, even though I love him? We have all these doubts and all these worries, and we have a hard time forgiving ourselves. But Paul said this to the Galatians in 1:15, 1:16. He said, so that he could reveal his grace in me. That's the turning the corner, folks. That's where you turn the corner. I don't know why God had me born alive, but then Paul came to the conclusion in the next verse, so that he could reveal his grace in me. You see, Paul said the same thing to the Corinthians in a different way. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in verse 8, after he says, my life, it was a miscarriage. It should have been aborted because I missed, Jesus was seen by more than 500 people at once. Peter, James, John, all those guys were there in his ministry. I wasn't even around. I missed the ministry of Jesus. I'm not worthy to be called an apostle because I persecuted the church. And he says this, I was born as one born out of due time. And then he says this, because I persecuted the church. Then he says in 1 Corinthians 15:10, but by God's grace, I am what I am. And the grace that's working in me is not in vain, but it works in me. And he goes on to talk about the grace of God working in him to produce good things in his life and ministry. See, that's the conclusion you and I have to come to. It's a conclusion I came to years ago, decades ago at this point, when I was a kid. No matter how bad I felt about myself, no matter how bad I have a hard time forgiving myself, no matter how badly I felt like, if I wasn't here, mom and dad would still be together. You have your own reasons. Those are mine. But what I came to is the same conclusion that Paul did. By the grace of God, I am what I am. He had me be a live birth so that he could reveal his grace in me. Paul said, Jesus came into the world to forgive sinners, of whom I am chief. Peter wrote in 1 Peter chapter, 4 and verse 10, 1 Peter 4:10, he said, those who have received the grace, give the grace, because now you are a steward of the multiple or multifaceted grace of God. 1 Peter 4:10, those who receive the gift or the grace, who have received the grace, give it out. Because once you receive that grace, you are now a steward of the multifaceted grace of God, the wisdom of God, the knowledge of God. And so you say, why does my life exist? Number one, it exists, like Paul said in Galatians 1:15, so that he could reveal his grace in you. It is in your massive amounts of sin and difficulties that you had that he reveals his grace and he shows mercy, so that you can be an example of God's grace to other people. As you've received the grace, so give the grace. And the other thing to remember is what Paul said. He had to first conclude within himself. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10, by God's grace, I am what I am. And the grace that's working in me is not in vain. And he talks about his ministry and everything that he's walking in at that point. But still in the back of his mind, he's wrestling with this. And he's just telling his story. I felt like my life was a miscarriage, an abortion, or should have been, because I persecuted the church. I'm not called to be an apostle, but by God's grace, I am what I am. You have to come to the conclusion, I am what I am. I am, by God's grace, what I am. God caused me to live so that he could show his grace in me. Focus on the grace. Don't focus on the past. Don't focus on the present. Focus on the fact that you are a believer in Jesus. You're born again. You've been sealed by the Holy Spirit. Yes, the Lord's grace is bigger than your sin. Focus on that fact. Focus on the grace of God. And now focus on what he is doing in you. All right. God bless. John Fenn, cwowi.org.